Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. And it's a delight to see the forum so filled for an international subject. Americans have been so transfixed with our domestic problems lately that we certainly filled the forum yesterday for that, but there is a big world out there, and it's important to keep that in mind. So it's good to see a full house this evening. Also, we have a subject, globalization, which has become very much a major concern around the world. Indeed, one of the things that can get people out into the streets for better and for worse. And today for better, or this evening for better, we have two people to debate the problems of globalization, the IMF, who essentially symbolize it. George Soros is a distinguished financier and actor and philanthropist in the world of globalization. Jeff Sachs as a distinguished economist and also an actor in the sense of advising to governments about what to do about globalization. You couldn't ask for two better people, and to introduce them, let me call upon my colleague and friend, former Dean of the Kennedy School, Graham Allison, and currently Director of the school's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Graham.
Well, let me begin with George Soros, who will make some comments, and then after George has made comments both about the general subject and about a new book that he's bringing out, I'll introduce Jeff Sachs. Jeff is a local, and we're glad to have him always, but we're especially pleased to have our guest. We're especially pleased to have our guest here tonight, who is a man of many seasons and multiple dimensions. Most of you are familiar with his biography, but personally, having had the good fortune to count George as a friend and colleague in arms for many years, especially in attempting to address the challenges of Russia's transformation, what I think is most fascinating about this individual is his complexity. So let me give a few angles, at least as I see them. George, if you were doing Gilbert and Sullivan, would be the very model of a modern international American. Born in Hungary, he came to America to make his fortune. That part was relatively easy. More intriguing is the way in which he became not a hyphenated American, but rather a model American citizen of the world, who feels as comfortable in a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen countries as here at home. Secondly, for students here at the college or the university, George is living proof that smart matters. As one of the most insightful and successful investment managers of his generation, he's identified and exploited and explained the dynamics of international financial markets, phenomena that continue to baffle lesser minds like most of the rest of us. On one occasion, he reportedly made more than $1 billion betting against what he judged to be an unsustainable exchange rate for the pound. When the Asian collapse occurred in '98, and people like Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir was looking for a villain, George Soros was his nominee, in that case totally unjustly, since George hadn't actually been in that market. Third, again, for students who wonder about their high tuitions at Harvard, George reminds us that education matters. Educated at London School of Economics as a student of the philosopher Karl Popper, George has explored deeply the foundations of Popper's open society. He's developed his own theories of reflexivity, a lens through which he sees not the equilibrium conditions that economists take as their norm or expectation, but rather disequilibria that provide both dangers and opportunities as the fundamental concept. Fourth, not surprisingly, George believes that ideas matter. Some of his central ideas are presented effectively in his newest book, which is just now coming out this month. It's called Open Society, Reforming Global Capitalism. And part of the purpose tonight is to give George a chance to present some part of these arguments, though not all of them, because this book contains a dozen complex and important arguments. This book revises views he expressed in 1998 about the imminent disintegration of the global capitalist system, which he acknowledges forthrightly were incorrect. But George, nonetheless, in this book, sustains an argument that unchecked capitalism and market fundamentalism threaten freedom and democracy around the world. And he presents a compelling vision of an alliance of open societies committed to supporting emerging democracies and market economies, thereby laying the groundwork for what he envisages as a global open society. One of the issues that arises in this context is the governance of the global economic system, which will be one of the topics on which George and Jeff, I hope, will disagree somewhat. But I think in the disagreements, one will see some illumination, not just heat. Finally, George stands without parallel as an exemplar of the belief that free societies and public policies to promote free societies matter. In fact, that they matter a whole lot more than money. Now, other people espouse similar views, but no one else puts more of his own money where his mouth is on such a proposition. George has, over the last decade, and I've watched this process with amazement, created an array of open society foundations around the world, a network that now operates in some 31 countries, from Central and Eastern Europe to the former Soviet Union to South Africa and around the world, that currently spend $500 million of George's money every year building global open society. So in this dimension, I think he's not just an entrepreneurial philanthropist, but I would call him an adventure capitalist. So for this multifaceted man whom we have learned so much from on 3 or 4 previous occasions when he's come here, let's welcome him and look forward to what he has to say.
Thank you very much, Graham. I'm not sure that I can live up to this introduction. I want to focus on just one particular subject that I deal with in the book. I think, as Graham said, there are many other issues more comprehensive, but I'd like to focus on the global financial architecture and sort of be a little bit more practical than some of the other ideas that I put forward. The global financial system that we know today is of relatively recent origin. It really took off in the 70s when you had the oil crisis and the transfer of capital from the oil-producing countries to the deficit countries through the banking system. And then it took off in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher sort of opening up markets and making it possible for capital to move around freely. The system is obviously crisis-prone because you had a tremendous crisis, international banking crisis in '82, which really carried through. There was practically a lost decade in Latin America. Then you had again the Mexican crisis and the reverberations in Latin America, which I think is in '94, right? And then in '97 you had a global crisis that really swept around the world. Swept around several times. Now, it's also remarkably resilient because we recover from the crisis rather rapidly, and even Russia, that was really pretty totally devastated financially, is currently doing better than it was before the crisis. Indonesia may be going down the drain, but that's sort of a sort of a relatively small side effect. On the whole, and the other thing, the remarkable thing about it is that it has not affected us, and therefore, we have the capacity of suffering other people's pain without flinching. This is the Spartan principle. Therefore, there isn't any great urgency about doing anything very radical to eliminate or reduce these crisis-prone character of or to reform the global financial architecture. Actually, there is a reform, and if you look at it, the system is quite different after 1999 than it was before the crisis. But the effect has been to downsize and to reduce the competence and influence of the international financial institutions. This stands in rather sharp contrast to what has happened in the past, because financial markets have always been prone to crises, and out of every crisis there was an institutional reform which strengthened the institutions. That's how central banking basically developed to its very elaborate stage of development. But we now have global markets, and we don't have global financial institutions equal to the need of maintaining stability in the system. There have been, as I say, reforms, but they are based on imposing market discipline, which is a very good thing as far as it goes. But in my opinion, it isn't enough. In fact, the crisis is blamed not on the instability of financial markets, but on deficiencies in particular countries and economies, and to a large extent on the international financial, on the IMF itself, because it is claimed, and I think correctly so, that the IMF, in its efforts to maintain the stability of the financial system, bails out the creditors and effectively forces the debtors to absorb eventually to absorb the cost. I think this charge is valid, and I think the effort to eliminate the moral hazard is a step forward, and that step we have taken, because instead of bailing out, the emphasis is now on bailing in, burden sharing by the private sector, in fact, the private sector was severely enough penalized in the crisis that they are now very fully aware of the risks of investing in emerging markets. Now, as I say, this is an important step forward, but it reveals the real risks of investing in emerging markets, and the private sector is not a philanthropic institution, and therefore, if it has to share the burden, so-called, it then charges for that burden. And therefore, the cost of capital has increased. And the discrepancy between the availability of capital at the center and at the periphery has greatly increased. The periphery is at a great disadvantage because capital can move freely, and the savings are basically sucked up from all over the world into the global financial markets. And if the money is not pumped out, then there is a shortage of capital at the periphery. So by curing the moral hazard, we have revealed another deficiency in the system, and that is an uneven playing field. Now, this idea that you have an uneven playing field is simply not acceptable at the present time to the let's say the international community, those who are in charge. And this is where I think that the problem lies. There is a belief that you have to leave it to the markets, that you have to rely on the market to the greatest possible extent. Sometimes this is even exaggerated. In the book, I inveigh against what I call market fundamentalism. And actually, the only really imaginative and radical reform proposal was the Meltzer Commission that Jeff was a member of. And that commission argues that basically there is much less need for international financial institutions. And although there is I think very much at Jeff's instigation, there is a sort of a bow towards the most disadvantaged. Other than that, the idea of an uneven playing field is not in the cards. The result, and there have also been a number of other rather pedestrian but nevertheless very important reforms, transparency, various standards and so on. There's a result of which I think that the crisis that we've had in 97, 99 will not recur, because that crisis was caused by an excessive flow of capital, and that will be prevented. However, I think the next problem, the one that is already noticeable, is an inadequate flow of capital. And we can already see it because you can see how the United States can sustain a very large balance of trade deficit, using the savings attracted from all over the world. You see the increased cost of capital in the spreads that borrowers in emerging markets have to pay. They practically maybe double, 10% higher than the United States. You can see in the growth rates, the difference in the growth rates in the United States and in the periphery. And you can see in the behavior of the equity markets, because the equity markets in emerging markets started declining before ours did. Now, if actually the crisis of 97-9 was very unusual, because it occurred only at the periphery. It was not touched off by a rise in interest rates or a slowdown in the economy at the center. Now, I think we may now see possibly and in my opinion quite likely, a slowdown in the world economy, and that is going to test the international system rather severely. And I think we are less well prepared for we have got less institutional support available now than we had in '97. Now, what could be done to address this uneven playing field? I think that there has to be some incentives, some guarantees offered to investors investing in countries which are actually following sound policies, so that capital is available more abundantly and less expensively. I think you also need some new way of helping countries to make the transition from a closed, inefficient economy, be it a communist, socialist, or just simply inefficient, to a more modern and open economy. And that is that is, of course, a task which is the IMF, as it is currently constituted, is not suited to carry out. And in fact, one of the great tragedies of recent history was that we entrusted the task of helping Russia and the other formerly communist countries to the IMF, because the IMF method of signing letters of intent, and then if the government doesn't deliver on that attempt, stopping the support, is not applicable to a country like Russia, which did not have a functioning government. So that was actually just, we did not want to lay out our own money, so we kind of tapped into the IMF, and I think that was the beginning of where the IMF has gone wrong. So that is an issue. There are countries that have introduced reforms. Let's say Bulgaria has done all the right things, but there is no growth. And so actually the political support for the regime is declining. There ought to be some support available to get them going. But that would be more of a political decision, very different from the kind of rules that ought to apply to the IMF, which ought to be guided by strictly financial considerations. I could actually go on, but I think I probably have exceeded my time, because I have some ideas about the World Bank also, but I think we can exchange views later.
Good, good. So let me turn to Jeff. As I say, Jeff is a local whom we are glad to have here as the director of the Center for International Development here at the Kennedy School, formerly the director of HIID and the Stone Professor of International Trade at Harvard University. As George has already referenced, Jeff served earlier this year as a member of a congressionally established commission called the International Financial Institutions Advisory Commission, or sometimes called the Meltzer Commission, since it was chaired by a fellow named Meltzer, excuse me, which recommended almost abolishing the IMF, but in any case not making the kind of changes that George was pointed towards, or that even Jeff is in favor of on some occasions, and maybe he'll say more about that tonight. Jeff has been an advisor of governments around the world in Latin America, Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, Asia, and Africa. He serves as co-chairman of the advisory board of the Global Competitiveness Report. He's educated here at Harvard College and has PhD in economics from Harvard, and has produced at least 100 articles and a number of books. But let me just turn to Jeff to say what he agrees with and what he disagrees with in terms of both what George has focused on tonight and the more general themes of the book.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back with you, George, here. This is the second installment, and this is a terrific book. So I do recommend it. That is a reflection of a careful read in the last few days, and there's really a great deal of wisdom. I congratulate you. I think you've gotten it almost all right, actually. And what I wanted to do was just help guide you to the ultimate conclusions of your analysis. We not only agree on most everything, we've been in a lot of battles together and have watched a lot of what's gone right and what's gone wrong in the world since pretty close involvement together since 1987, actually. Which was a period when George and I think, were just about very few voices calling for debt cancellation for poor countries back in the mid-1980s when it was not a popular cause. We were still 13 years from the Jubilee, and it took a while to get people's thoughts around it. But George was an early advocate, and he and I were, I think, two voices out of about 100 and in various international meetings that Jack Kemp and Bill Bradley had in the mid-1980s. And then we battled together in what was a very heartening result, and I think George really merits tremendous praise of historic proportions for helping to open up Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 and 1990 and 1991. And I was very pleased and very honored to be together with you on a lot of those battles. Then we watched, not so successfully, the disasters unfold in Russia over the 1990s. What started as a near miracle of hope certainly did not turn out that way in the 90s, and both of us bemoaned, I think we may have been 2 out of 3 voices calling for vast increases of aid. I have a singing keychain now that doesn't stop. 2 out of the 3 voices calling for vastly greater aid for 2 out of 4, because my partner here, among others, in an early attempt to mobilize aid was Graham Allison, and then George, and I would add Richard Nixon to our distinguished group, saying that there really needed to be a very different approach, but instead we sent the IMF into Russia, and that is a good way to bring down an empire, but not a very good way to heal a sick society, and that's what we saw together. And since then, we've been debating a lot also about globalization, so this is another installment that I've been looking forward to very much. We actually agree on the basic point that globalization is not working in a fundamental sense, and that is that it is not delivering benefits for a large part of the world. It is delivering benefits for the core, as George calls it, and as is often called the core but not the periphery of the world, as long as one defines those concepts. The core in economic terms, I think, is the set of societies that are engaged in technological innovation and that are providing the leading edge of economic change. And almost any way that you count that, that's only about 1/6 of the world that is part of this dynamic, technologically productive world system right now. A lot of the rest of the world is still benefiting from globalization because it's able to use those technologies and catch up. But as George described this process of hooking countries into this world system as being one that's very hard and very unstable, even the relatively successful of the developing countries have faced bumps in the road that are a lot larger than anything one would have expected or that was justified by the ills or the sins of the society. And we've seen countries hit very, very sharp crises in the 1990s, not for having done the wrong thing, but for having done the right thing, in essence, of trying to join the international system after decades of closure, only to find that it didn't feel so good afterwards. But after having opened up, there were very, very sharp shocks to Mexico in '94 or in East Asia, as George mentioned, in 1997. There's a third part of the world which George does not focus enough on, and I want to make clear as part of our world, and that's the part of the world that's so poor and so marginalized it doesn't even get into a book about global capitalism because it's not considered part of the international system. But alas, there are about 2 billion people in that world. They are the people at the absolute bottom of the world in terms of material well-being. My estimates are that 10 to 15 million people in that group are dying needless deaths every year from diseases that are utterly preventable, but they're dying for lack of the most basic access to medical care or the most basic access to nutrition. It is fashionable to talk about the very poor people to say they're at the edge of survival, and I always want to stress, no, they are not at the edge of survival. They're falling off the edge every day in large numbers, but they don't make even page D17 of our newspapers. Thank you. I think it means to sit down, probably. 3 million.
You've got 5 more minutes, so you're okay.
3 million people die of diseases that are preventable by vaccines that often cost 10 cents a dose. 400,000 from tetanus, 800,000 from measles, and on goes the list. And millions more die of other preventable, easily preventable causes. They're in the 2 million of the world's poorest people, and they've had an even harder time. They don't even have the benefit of a financial crisis because no one gave them finance in the first place to make a crisis afterwards. They just suffer and decline, and we don't address their needs either. Now, George is absolutely right, and it's been my passion for the last 15 years also to try to make this playing field more level and to try to figure out how to do that. That's not actually the right metaphor. It's, the world is filled with mountains and valleys and landlocked regions and difficult places. And it's not a matter of making a smooth playing field. It's trying to understand what to do in a world where people have such different opportunities, different capabilities, different starting points, different burdens. We can walk out here tonight with 0 chance of being bitten by an Anopheles gambiae mosquito and therefore getting malaria by the time we get home. But if we were having this conference in Nigeria, a good chance is we'd walk out, and if we didn't have malaria already, we'd get an infective bite, because you have an average of 1 infective bite per day in many parts of tropical sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the inequality that we face, and we have to address it. What to do? Well, my view, and it's actually George's view all through this, is that we tried to fake it in the United States for the last 20 years. We don't want to hear anything about that. We want to say that, gee, just pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, get to it, do that good work, and open your economies, and everything will proceed nicely for you. And don't mind the mosquitoes. They're not a problem for us. We don't see why they should be a problem for you. And if you're having any difficulties, call the IMF. The IMF is right now, I printed out the list as of this week, the IMF is currently in 55 countries in the world that have 1.6 billion people. That's 60% of the developing world outside of China and India are under IMF programs. What does that really mean? I think George says it right, but he doesn't follow through to the logical conclusion. The role of the IMF is to keep poor people away from US taxpayers, honestly. We don't want to hear about the deep problems, so we want to send a group that says, tighten your belts. What's your problem? Live within your means. do the right things. Everything will be okay. We don't want to think very hard about low productivity agriculture or mosquito bites that deliver multiple tropical diseases or millions of people dying. So we talk about tax reform, civil service reform, belt tightening, and so forth. And the IMF has been a buffer in 3 instances in the last 20 years. For the poorest countries in the world, it's been effectively running those countries in the same way that the British government did when the Ottoman Empire went bankrupt in 1875, or when the Egypt went bankrupt in 1880. You just send in, then you used to send in the British Army, now we send in the IMF. It's not a lot of difference, actually. And the results are about similar. Egypt had 100 years of difficulty after that. You don't get out of these problems if you don't face the deeper causes. So that was failure number 1 in the poorest countries. Failure number 2 was in the post-communist countries. Wrong mission, but George said it exactly right. The IMF was there so that we didn't have to be there putting in real money. And both of us begged for it in various ways, but it never came. And the third is to handle financial crises, to make sure creditors get repaid and that countries borrow the money they need to keep paying our banks back. And then they can pay us back in a longer period of time. But rather than private loans going bad, we push Korea, for example, to guarantee all of the private loans that our banks made to their banks. So we get the Korean government to guarantee that, and we tell them, don't worry about it, we'll lend you the money to pay back our banks, and then you can pay us back in 7 years, so that our creditors don't lose any money. So we have had case after case of failure. And that's why I don't subscribe in the end, because you explain it so beautifully, that this is a central core institution. It's run by 3 or 4 countries. Basically, you know, there's this terrific block from 15th Street to 19th Street along Pennsylvania Avenue. And you start at 15th with the Treasury, you go to 16th with the White House, 17th Street with the Executive Office Building, 18th Street with the World Bank, and 19th Street with the IMF. And don't misunderstand what's happening in those 5 blocks. The U.S. runs those institutions, and the U.S. runs it for U.S. interests, so I can't see strengthening them to run more of the world until we've wised up completely to what we're doing. And we're so incredibly cheap in this country right now that we're faking it with those institutions. And I see it in the countries where I'm working all the time, that it's not leading to solutions. What it is telling them, quiet down for another year. This time it's really going to work. You didn't like the last 20 years, we have a new remedy for you if you'll just follow the lesson. And I was late for dinner because the IMF is in country number 56 negotiating right now some crazy scheme. And it's going to do the same thing there. The World Bank, by the way, is in 90 countries with 4.3 billion people, because it also has China and India. Now, I want to say a word about this interesting report in 2 minutes. You said 1, I'll take 2, and then I'll finish up. The Meltzer Commission was a very interesting phenomenon, and I want to explain what I did on it. And why I think it was an interesting process for us. This was a commission, like most congressional commissions, where the Democrats appointed some people and the Republicans appointed others. And the Republicans, who were in the majority, had 6 members of the commission. The Democrats appointed 5. I was one of the 5 Democratic commissioners, no doubt to the chagrin of the Democratic Party leadership afterwards, because I was the Democrat that signed with the Republicans. In the end, signed this report. Now, what I learned about Washington was what you all know, but I found it absolutely extraordinary. We had 5 months of good, honest, bipartisan consideration of issues. And then the last 3 weeks was an absolute concerted attempt to turn this thing into a partisan scramble, where the instructions were, you just side with your party. Because the partisanship in Washington is absolutely mind-boggling, even when it's on issues that have nothing to do with partisanship like this one. And I resented it terribly, I have to say, that I was being asked not to consider the issues, but to consider party loyalties because it was us versus them. And that's nonsense. Even though there were conservatives on the other side, much more conservative than I can assure you, it wasn't us versus them or enemies on one side and friends on the other side. It was an attempt, I felt, to find a bipartisan foreign policy, which this country has not had since the end of the Cold War. Now, let me tell you what these conservatives voted for example. The Commission voted unanimously that the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Regional Development Bank should write off in their entirety all claims against heavily indebted countries. The Commission voted unanimously that the United States, quote, the United States should be prepared to increase significantly its budgetary support for the poorest countries if they pursue effective programs of economic development. These were conservatives that had not said a nice word about foreign assistance publicly, at least for years. And what they understood in our deliberations was that we need a bipartisan approach. And they wanted institutions that were pared back to do the honest work of monetary stabilization, which the IMF no longer does, but at the same time to recognize U.S. responsibilities. And the bottom line was that I was told, this is shambolic, you know, you've been used, this is ridiculous. But last week, President Clinton signed legislation that was supported by bipartisan leadership of conservatives and liberals to cancel all of the U.S. claims against the least developed countries.
Did they put up the money for the World Bank portion?
Yes, that's the $435 million. And I know that the work we did had sensitized a conservative Republican leadership to this issue that was not sympathetic to it. And the point I want to make is we need in this country a new approach to how we deal with issues like this, since anyway we're heading towards parliamentary democracy, it seems. We need a bipartisan approach in which the United States recognizes as the world's richest country in the history of the world, and having gone through the greatest wealth creation in the history of the world, we have to do more for the billions of people that are falling off the edge and losing lives for want of it.
Let me give Georgia an opportunity to reply, and then we're going to go to discussion and debate more generally.
No, I think we should go to the discussion because time is gone. I think we should go to the questions. We can debate.
Minos, you can put your first question. Minos Zalmanakis is he's been a member of the school's family for a long time. He actually graduated from the school before it was the Kennedy School and invented the Eurodollar market in one of his other incarnations. So Minos, make a short comment. Yeah.
Okay, if you will allow me to sort of make a short comment, because somebody has to say something about the evolution of the IMF and how this thing was happening. When the IMF was founded, of course, these things didn't exist.
Talk to the microphone. Yes.
And we came into a point where IMF became practically non-usable until the oil crisis. And thank God, by that time, we have worked some kind of mechanism, what he calls the Eurodollar, which was used for the recycling of this mass amount of money going back and forth. And it was used to such an extent that the world got so much money that the whole system collapsed. And in October of 1982, the Mexicans went to De La Rosière on a Friday and said, Monday, we're declaring a unilateral moratorium, and the world is collapsing. I just happened to be that afternoon in De La Rosière's office, and we debated, what do we do? I said, we're changing the definition of what constitutes a non-bankable loan. We'll call the banks, and we try to see how we more or less manage the situation. And that was the time, against the advice of all the staff of the fund, who were arguing that the fund has no mandate to deal with these issues, that De La Rosière started together with Volcker to save the banking system, which was another way of saying that was trying to save the creditors from collapsing, because the creditors were so much exposed that if Mexico were to declare the unilateral moratorium, the whole financial system of the world would have collapsed. Okay? And that now took us later to what do we do next? That coincided with the globalization, whatever you want to call it, free movement of capital, and so forth and so on. But then we have more or less, how do you structure this thing now? How do you deal with the disequalities that exist? Take, for example, today. We live in a world where we say, United States today has lack of savings. There are huge savings coming to this country from the rest of the world. Why? Because the United States is in a position today where they can work to increase productivity. Productivity brings profit, profit brings equity markets, and so forth and so on. The Europeans cannot afford to do that. Europeans cannot afford to increase productivity. Why? Because the Europeans have to increase capacity to absorb the 10% rate of unemployment they have in their countries. The same with the third world countries. So I agree with you. I was a member of the Bretton Woods Commission. We said we don't need the World Bank, but we need some kind of an IMF. Something has to be able there to regulate this kind of laws that don't really sort of work, or they're contradictory to what the various goals of the various parts of the world are. I'm sorry, I had to say that as a kind of a defense to this.
Please, we needed some defense after 2 attacks. Let me ask you if you want to put a question to line up at the microphones here on both sides, on the ground floor, and on both sides on the balcony. And let me see, George, do you want to make a comment on the IMF point in general?
No. Well, the only point I would make to Jeff, full of good intentions, he was actually sold a bill of goods by the Meltzer Commission because, for instance, the Meltzer Commission recommends getting the World Bank out of lending to medium-income countries and confine itself to the very poorest. Now, I would say that the institutions need to be reformed. I think that the way the World Bank works, it has some negative aspects, but particularly because it has to it's an intergovernmental activity. The lending, the rich countries represented on the board push the projects which benefit their industries rather than necessarily the countries that receive the aid, and the lending has to go through governments, and very often it is used to reinforce politically authoritarian or repressive regimes. So this is a big drawback. Nevertheless, if you were to abolish the World Bank, this facility, you would lose something very valuable. So instead of abolishing this, you ought to introduce new elements to the World Bank. For instance, Jeff talked very eloquently about basically global common goods, because fighting AIDS or malaria is a global common good, and it needs to be funded on a global basis. And for that, the World Bank developed the format of trust funds. And that is a much more flexible way. I mean, it's not right that a country would have to take a loan, let's say, to fight AIDS, because that doesn't actually produce the ability to repay the loan. It has to be a grant. Now, we have to recognize that. So, unfortunately, the tendency is to reduce these activities rather than to increase them. They did throw Jeff a bone, which is the highly indebted countries, and it's wonderful, but it's not at all enough.
Take the bones where you can get them.
Okay. The ground rules are, please state your name and your affiliation. Put your question, which is brief and ends with a question mark. If you want to make a short statement to disagree with the point that's a prelude to the question, that's okay too, as long as it's brief, and one to a customer. Let's start over here.
Hi, my name is Zayed Yassin. I'm a student at Harvard College. And many view the greatest problems regarding globalization as the entry of transnational corporations into developing nations. Shell Nigeria cites an easy example of a transnational corporation that bought a government and then proceeded to rape its people. But governments as a whole don't have the capital to develop natural resources or a modern economy and don't have the expertise and experience. So how do we balance the value that these TNCs can provide with the fundamental rights of a nation and a nation's people to the values of their natural resources?
Well, first of all, governments are not very good at producing wealth, so it's better left to companies. However, transnational corporations need also to be regulated. Now, for instance, take the case of oil companies. I think that they could be forced to disclose how much royalties they pay in individual countries, in Angola, Nigeria. How much are they paying in commissions to get the concessions? Then you could add it up, and you could see how much the countries receive, and the people living in that country could demand from their governments what happened to that money. So I think that would be, for instance, one way to exert pressure on and fight corruption throughout the world.
Who would exert this pressure?
I think that the Securities and Exchange Commission could easily introduce such a requirement, and this is where actually civil society and endowment funds like Harvard Endowment could play a role. You see, because.
Jeff, you want to make a quick comment on
Yeah,
that too?
I would encourage you to separate two kinds of transnational activities. In general, you look at almost any development experience in the last 40 or 50 years, development based on primary commodities has not been a very successful route for long-term economic growth. So Nigeria is the most egregious example, but almost every oil country has had a very bad run, as have most countries that depend on primary commodities. There's another set of transnational activities, which are the middle and the higher technology companies that go to invest in places because there's lower cost labor, but use those places as an export base for their international production. And if you look at the experience of countries that are lucky enough to get that kind of investment, which is very different from the oil company investment, you'll find actually that that's been one of the most significant engines of economic growth in the successful countries. There's one country, for example, that has a lot of manufacturing exports, 95% of which are from transnationals. I'm thinking of Singapore. It also has $28,000 per capita income, so the TNCs have hardly done it damage. Ireland, Israel, now Costa Rica, Malaysia are all examples where Intel came in, and you date the arrival of Intel and you watch the economic growth for the next 10 years. So what is more fundamental than the transnationals is the question of the development strategy that countries are following and how to promote a favorable development strategy. Nigeria or Venezuela or a number of others that I could list that could conceivably think that oil is their ticket to growth misunderstand fundamentally that technology and knowledge is the way to get ahead in the world. But similarly, because knowledge is so essential, the idea that you could somehow be part of a world knowledge economy without having the main holders of that knowledge, which are the private sector right now, participating in your economy, I think is also disproved by global examples. So I would suggest that you look at the development strategy and realize that countries that are trying to pursue a primary commodity-based strategy are living a 19th century strategy in the 21st century. That's the problem.
Thank you.
Let's go to the gentleman here.
Thank you both very much for your very insightful comments. My name is Harpal Alberto Colli. I'm a junior at the college. And Mr. Soros, you cut short your discussion a bit of the World Bank. So I was wondering, other than the trusts, which you mentioned as a good sign, what specific programs in the World Bank and methods of operating do you think should be maintained the way they are, and what changes do you think need to be made in the World Bank?
Yeah. As I say, I think that the existing lending, which is a kind of in a way a triumph of financial engineering, because based on a guarantee that is never called on, actually large amounts of money can be moved, should not be touched. I think that the Meltzer Commission attributed a certain cost to the U.S. taxpayer by providing that guarantee. I think that taking market principles a little too far, in my opinion. So I don't think you should touch it. I think you should try to make the bank a little bit less dependent on the directors, so that the directors should be maybe elected in their individual capacity rather than representatives of a country. And this trust fund idea is, I think, the one that is very important, because that's not lending, that's actually genuine aid. It could, of course, be reversed. I mean, you could have a trust fund for micro lending, where you would get the money back, or most of it, but you would have a greater concessional element in it.
Let me go up to the right-hand balcony, please.
Hi, my name is Jay Nair. I'm a senior in the college. You have both mentioned the need for more to be done, which needs to be motivated by an awareness on the part of governments and their taxpayers by the need. How do you propose to move public opinion in that direction?
That is really the main question that I pose in the book, and I think only all of us together can do it, because governments basically are. Governments have no principles; they have only interests, right? However, if you have principles, if the democratic governments do respond to the electorate, and therefore if the electorate were to be mobilized, and this refers particularly to the United States, because we are the center, and the center is not a defined center as who is in charge, who has autonomy over its decision making. The United States is in a position to change the system, and therefore somehow we ought to be able to mobilize public opinion in the United States in favor of it. And I'm really quite distressed that the NGOs have been sort of fallen into an unholy alliance with the congressional majority in trying to kill off the international institutions we have, rather than to strengthen them and reform them.
Jeff, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I don't think that that's really the issue. I think the issue has been, for the last 20 years, whether we're going to vote any money for this. It's not even where it goes, it's whether we're going to pay anything. I think it's important to understand that in the last administration, in the outgoing Clinton administration, foreign aid has basically been eliminated. as a consideration of U.S. policy, except for the Middle East. We're down to essentially nothing, rounding error by any macroeconomic standard. We're giving about $700 million total, and depending, you could, if you want to be very generous, you could say it's $1 billion for the 620 million people living in the least developed countries. We've essentially dropped to nothing. That's 1/100th of 1% of our income. And it's this, and basically one should understand that for the last 30 years, even when there was foreign assistance, it was very heavily directed at strategic considerations, Cold War considerations. And so when the Cold War ended and we had roughly a $200 billion a year budget peace dividend through reductions of military spending, we chose not only to spend zero of it on helping poor people, we actually reduced further the budgets that went to poor people. This administration had the biggest collapse of foreign aid of any of the post-war administrations in the United States. This is why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because we're at zero. We can't go less. And it would be so little for us to do something, that we're actually going to do it. We really will do it. I found in the work in the last couple of years on the debt cancellation, where I was told it would never happen, that, you know, there were people, very conservative Republicans, as I said, that became champions of this cause. A wide spectrum of people interested. Now I'm dealing a lot on the health issues. A lot of congressmen, no matter what side of the aisle, like the idea of putting immunizations in the arms of children to save their lives. These are not evil people, and they're not representing evil constituencies. What they do want to see is whether it can work, whether there's a practical approach, whether it can be monitored, whether you can deliver. What I disagree with George only in tactics, because I don't think it really matters, if we put in another $10 billion, I don't think it ought to go to the IMF and the World Bank. They're the wrong institutions. I'd love to give it to the World Health Organization to actually get something done.
Because you haven't dealt with them. Because you haven't dealt with them.
I'm sorry?
You have not dealt with them. I have dealt with them. So, I mean, the fact is, and this is, you know, these institutions, it's very, very hard, actually, to deliver aid. It's easier to make a few $1 billion in the market than it is to... Really.
At least tell us how to do that, George.
There's an old joke
Fund
about
our own bank.
there's an old joke about the singing contest in which the judge awards the prize to the second of two contestants after having heard only the first compete. I think that we often do that in picking the institution that we think would be most deserving. We're up here on the left balcony, please.
Hello, my name is Ashok Parmeshwaran. I'm an alumnus of the Kennedy School and an investor in emerging market debt, and so a beneficiary of the generosity of the IMF in recent years. I had a question relating to Argentina. As you know, Argentina has been in a recession for the last couple of years, and because of its currency board system, it has very little fiscal flexibility and no monetary flexibility for it to get out of this recession. In recent months, it's been facing an increasingly tight liquidity situation, and it seems now that Argentina won't be able to access market funding at reasonable rates, and so has been going to banks and pension funds and non-extraordinary sources to find funding. In the recent days, of course, there's been talk of an IMF package for Argentina. So my question is a very practical one to the both of you. What will the IMF do for Argentina, and what should they do? Is there any way that Argentina can pull itself out of this?
George, you give the investment advice.
I think that the IMF is going to put together a pretty large package because the alternative actually is default. Because Argentina has a currency board that cannot actually devalue. It's got a very fixed frozen exchange rate, and it's an overvalued exchange rate. it can work itself out of this trouble over a period of time. It means several years of lost growth or recession. You already have had now a couple, and you probably will continue to have. But I think that they will be bailed out because the alternative would be default, and that would be taken. That would be detrimental to the system.
To understand Argentina, I would really commend John Maynard Keynes' 1925 essay on the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill. When Keynes invented macroeconomics and explained why fixing an exchange rate at an overvalued level would lead to prolonged unemployment. Argentina went into a system that was predictably flawed. And for the last 5 years, I can tell you, I've been telling the Argentines, you're in trouble. They've been telling me, because that's how Argentina is, you don't understand Argentina. Alas, and not, no gloating, it's been clear for years that Argentina's in trouble. I don't know if the financial markets did or did not understand it. I have real doubts about the financial markets in general, of whether they know or care about macroeconomics or whether they're just hoping for the bailout at the end. I'm not sure it would be so detrimental if there were a default. I don't know what system is going to go under if there's a default, because we're a very resilient system, and another large bailout so that Argentina can live through more years of deflation strikes me as probably not a very good idea. They're already at 20% unemployment and have been for years, and they have no prospects of economic growth right now. And this has been clear in my mind. I've been writing it for 5 years that they're on this slope. I've had two principles. One, well, this is probably too wrong to say. I was going to say, don't listen to Argentines giving monetary advice. What I really meant by that was that in the heyday in 1994-95, when the Argentines were flush with their victory of the currency board, they were going all over Latin America selling this same pseudo-medicine to other countries. And that is the serious sense that I mean it.
Yeah, but you know, also the point that I was making about the lack of capital flows is what drags Argentina down. I mean, they pay a premium of what now 10% over euro-dollar on borrowings. So
it's preposterous. The whole system was to make it safe to lend Argentina.
So it is appropriate to give them relief.
I'm sorry?
It is appropriate to give them relief. Well, I'm not in any way disputing the fact that they have an overvalued currency, but nevertheless.
Oops, there it goes.
Okay. Okay, let's go to this gentleman. Here on the left, yes. Nobody can go out to their broker until we're finished, which is in 20 minutes. Please, sir. Yes.
Hello. My name is Ken Choi. I'm a student here at Kennedy School, and I'm a journalist from Korea. And, well, thanks for coming to this side of the river than the other side of the river. We need somebody at your caliber at this school. Actually, many Koreans appreciate for your coming to Korea during the economic crisis in 1997, 1998, because we are in a dire straits, and many Koreans, including the President of Korea, appreciates and have very high regards of you, unlike our Malaysian Prime Minister. My question is, New York Times recently ran an article about Professor Tobin, who advocated that just as we tax traded goods, we should tax on currencies, since you made a lot of money on speculating currencies on British pounds. I'd like to know what you think about this idea about Professor Tobin.
I actually think it's a good idea. It's difficult to implement now. I mean, he invented it at a time when you didn't have derivatives. Now you have derivatives, that is options and different synthetic contracts. So it would be rather difficult to impose the tax because of that. You see, because the current it's how do you I mean, how do you catch the transactions that go around a currency transaction? I think it can be done, though, and I think it would be an appropriate form of taxation.
One of the interesting lines of arguments in this new book, The Open Society, is George's distinction between making the rules and playing within the rules. And he makes a very vigorous argument about if the rules are set in one fashion, intelligent investors will play within them to their advantage, but that doesn't prohibit one from figuring out or making judgments that the rules need to be adjusted and making recommendations about adjustments to the rules. So,
well, I mean, you're right, because it wouldn't suit me to have to pay taxes, but I think it's actually it's the right thing. So.
Good. Here on the right, please.
Okay. My name is Basil Enwebara. I'm a student at MIT.
Get a little closer to the microphone, please, sir. Yeah.
I said, my name is Basil Enwebara. I'm a student at MIT. First of all, I want to thank Jeff for all his work, especially what he's doing in Nigeria now. I met him last 4 months in Nigeria, and I saw he's doing very good work. But my concern is, besides this debate that goes on around the world, nobody is talking about the fundamental problems. What I call the fundamental problems is that since 15th century till today, Africa has remained European backyard, from slavery to invisible empire, to visible empire, to invisible empire. I mean, they are using the IMF as a means of continuing its exploitation. So when will it be over? What I'm asking, can these African countries say enough is enough, we're not going to pay these debts? What are the possibilities of saying that? Thank you.
Well, you know, it's possible to say we want to be separate. We don't want to be part of the world. I think the penalty for that is very, very heavy. So actually, you are caught. You're caught in a system. Getting out of it would make things worse, and that's why we have to make the system work better and to give you an advantage. In other words, a system that it doesn't give benefits some benefits to all its members is not in the long run sustainable.
Jeff, quick comment?
Quick comment. The answer to your question is yes. Africa should just stop paying unilaterally today, as far as I'm concerned. And I'll tell you why. Nigeria is trying to launch a program to control AIDS. It's got 6% adult prevalence right now. It's on the point of a takeoff, an explosion. It's desperately trying to round up $60 million a year for a 3-year, $190 million AIDS program. You know how much it's paying this year to the international creditors? $1.6 billion for the year. It's 6 times the public health budget. So I've been a big fan of unilateral default for 20 years, and I've seen it work in a lot of places, and I mean it quite seriously. If any country that is in such incredible dire straits, desperate, life and death, does anything but husband its resources for its own survival, it's making a mistake. And the way the international system works is that if President Obasanjo, and especially if President Obasanjo and colleagues, unilaterally said, we're putting this into an AIDS fund, come and look. So you can you can punish us, you can have us die, or you can let us treat this disease, but come and look, it's going into the fund. They won't be touched, they'll be applauded, and it's time to do it.
We're up here on the right balcony. Yes.
Hi, my name is Amit Borde. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. The last few years, the U.S. has seen unprecedented growth in in terms of economy, in terms of markets. My question to Mr. Soros as an investor and probably a mover of the market is, in what time frame do you think this upturn will change into a downturn? And then my question to, there's been a lot of talk about it, it's reaching its peak and so on. Maybe you can start seeing that in 4 months or so. And then my question to Professor Sachs is, in that scenario, the last 8 years have been good, and even then the 8 has been at the bottom. In that scenario, what happens to your optimism?
I think that we are probably going to have a hard landing. You have all the signals of of an end of cycle phenomena. Now, it is possible that it's a different world, that you could have let's say, a slowdown in the rate of capital spending, and nevertheless, the gains in productivity would continue to increase because it's a network economy, and things sort of reverberate around, and they're still reinforcing themselves. It's possible, but the burden of proof is on those who claim that. So I do expect a hard landing, which is not necessarily a negative growth, but reduction in the rate of growth, rate of capital spending, productivity, and eventually consumer spending and so on.
Jeff, from zero, where do you go in that world? Yeah.
Well, I think first, I think that George is, let's just say, I would guess the same way, that we've had a bubble here that is at least gently deflating now, and it could get worse. If we have no president by next April, it will get worse. The reason for, I don't know if it's optimism or realism or at least attempt to do something anyway, is again that, if I were trying to convince Americans to give $1,000 of their income to these purposes, on average, at a $35,000 per capita average income, it wouldn't be a tragedy, 3%, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, how about $10? And even if we have a downturn or a growth slowdown, $10 per capita, which if generalized in the advanced economies would be $10 billion extra, for example, that we'll be able to afford whether the market bounces up or down. If we have a disaster here, then of course all bets are off. I would agree with you, but we are so rich beyond belief that there's plenty of cushion before it starts to hurt to give $10 per American.
Here on the left balcony.
My name is Mike Weissman. I work here at the Kennedy School. There's been some discussion this evening of the significant inflows of global capital to U.S. equity markets because of the advantage the U.S. economy has had in growth and productivity, and investors in the rest of the world want to take part in that. At such time as there is a market slowdown or recession in the U.S. economy, what do you think the chances are for those significant inflows to become very rapid outflows and to exacerbate conditions in the U.S. economy? And then what do you think the effects might be of that exacerbated slowdown in the rest of the world? And Mr. Soros, you mentioned earlier this evening that the U.S. has yet to feel pain that the global system can deal out. If we do end up in this scenario, what do you think the effects might be on the U.S. view toward the global system?
I actually think that there would be no outflow of capital, or no significant outflow of capital, because I don't think that, let's say, an Indian capitalist is going to take his money out of the U.S. and take it back to India, or any other, or most other countries. So actually, I expect that people would be looking for safety, and they might be buying treasury bonds, but U.S. treasury bonds, rather than let's say, high-flying stocks. So I'd expect the dollar to even to strengthen further in that, which is quite contrary to what economists would, many economists would predict. I don't know what was the, that's it. That's
the main. And would that end up having then some significant impact on U.S. views towards the global economy?
Yeah, but there's always that danger, you know, that you turn protectionist. But again, I would not overemphasize that, because we derive such benefits from the system that the protectionist voices are likely to remain few and far between. The real issue facing the United States is whether it wants to follow a unilateralist, hegemonial foreign policy, or a more multilateral policy, more concerned with the effect on the system as a whole, on the other parts of the country. That is the real choice, I think. Isolationism today is not a choice for the United States.
We get about 5 minutes left, and so we're not going to get all the questions, but we're going to get as many as possible. If they'll be brief, and we'll try to do brief answers. Here on the left.
Hi, my name is Ricken Patel. I'm a Canadian second-year student at the Kennedy School. And thank you for coming. It's wonderful to hear all the things you guys are saying, and it's a shame there aren't more in higher positions saying the same things that you are. My question was following on from Amit's and Mark's, was just, Mr. Soros, in backing off from your claims about the gravity of the threat of a global financial instability to the world economy, do you feel that that might be, backing off that claim based on 2 years of experience, do you think that might be an example of the kind of reflexivity that you presciently kind of criticize in your first book, in the sense of adjusting your assessment to a very small amount of experience? And I'll leave it at that.
I don't quite get your question. I'm sorry.
In terms of forming your position on the system of global financial instability and what threat it poses in 1998, and then adjusting it on the basis of a short period of experience between 1998 and 1999 or 2000.
Right.
Isn't that sort of an example of adjusting your views based on a very small amount of experience that, if I understood reflexivity correctly?
Look, I went overboard in '98 in saying that the system is about to collapse. That clearly hasn't happened. I have to admit it. If it happens next year, it won't be that prediction that has come true.
Oh. This you would never hear from an academic who will always claim that I was right just a little later, and certainly for the reasons that I meant to say, even if I didn't quite explain them appropriately. We're over. But for this honesty, this is a fresh breath. Okay, please.
Thank you. My name is Jean Mulot, mid-career student at KSG. I have two short questions related.
No, just one, please.
Okay, I will boil it down.
With two parts.
Sorry. And quickly, because we got several other people, please.
Concerning the World Bank and its function, we've seen that the World Bank does different things, one of them being a think tank, providing knowledge, another one being a bank, channeling resources. It seems that it does the first part relatively well, but the second it does it in a manner that it used this amazing brain power as a marketing department, squeezing actually bad plans on countries. What would you think of the idea to split the two functions in order to get the incentives right?
Good. Jeff, would you make a short answer? Yeah.
Bravo. That's why I propose that we change the name to the World Development Agency and we privatize the bank part and keep the $30 billion that's paid in capital right now. That's even bigger than Harvard's endowment, but we do a lot more for the world out of that money. And I would even increase the endowment to $100 billion for the World Development Agency, and then use it actually to help solve technological problems and help work on climate change and other issues which are deep and not understood and underfinanced right now. Just two examples. The World Bank proudly supports tropical disease research. TDR, it's called at the World Health Organization. It puts in $30 million a year. Do you know that the private pharmaceuticals are doing $40 billion a year, but not for tropical disease? The World Bank proudly supports tropical agricultural research. It puts in $50 million a year. Monsanto, our life sciences company, does $800 million of R&D itself. We've got nothing commensurate with the scale, so we need to think, not to make loans. The bank, there are plenty of banks in the world, but we don't have a development agency that's actually doing thinking. And that's what we need to hive off and really focus the brain power on that, it seems to me.
You know, I mean, it would be very nice if you could get an increase in funding for a World Development Agency. The fact is that you couldn't. And therefore, what you have got is a guarantee from the various sovereign countries, which is not to be called on ever, but which does throw off a reasonable income, which pays for the think tank part of the World Bank, and it would be a pity to destroy it because you can't put anything in its place. If you could do your way, would be wonderful. But if you can't do it that way, at least let's not throw away what we've got.
Just a point about the way the World Bank works is that it lends at the rate that it borrows plus 75 basis
And
points.
out of that 75...
No, but that just pays for the lending staff. The total income that's used for these grants and so forth is the paid-in capital, nothing more. You could eliminate all the lending without affecting the income stream of the bank that's actually used for the grant portion, because they're designed to make no profits. And Larry Summers, Treasury Secretary, made a good suggestion to try to raise the margin above the administrative fee, and he was totally shot down by the whole institution this past summer. So there's no income thrown off from the lending itself, surprisingly.
Interesting. Okay. Let's take the last question from the lady here in the balcony, please.
Thank you. My name's Laura Atkins. I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. And first, I'd like to say I'm very happy that the U.S. government has decided to forgive some of the debt from the developing countries and the role you've played in it. But my question is has any thought been given, or is there any way to use debt relief as an incentive to increase transparency and reduce corruption in some of these countries? And if all the debt were suddenly to be forgiven in these countries, is there a way for the world community to ensure that it actually goes to public health and education and not into the pockets of a few people?
I think it is used that way. This is the basis of that forgiveness.
That's the idea. Whether it gets implemented, we will see, but it's clearly built into the concept that it be channeled in a monitored way with civil society within the countries participating in the monitoring. That's the concept. How the concept will get translated to reality is something that we're going to have to watch.
To the dozens of other people who would like to ask a question, I have the bad fortune of being the timekeeper, and we've reached our witching hour for tonight. We don't want to wear George out entirely, since we hope to get him back here frequently. Let me say on behalf of all of us what an interesting and illuminating discussion this has been. Let me recommend to you again, which you can get from Amazon or even at the Coop, Open Society, Reforming Global Capitalism. And let's say thanks to Jeff and George for an excellent
Read my book and try to answer. Then we get